On our newscast tonight, father of one of the students who died in April's ferry tragedy ends his hunger strike, and we will tell you why. Korea now has a record current account surplus for 29 straight months. What does that mean for domestic demand? We have more coming up. And Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe continues to upset neighboring countries with his distorted view of history. His latest feat calling war criminals national heroes. Stay with us for these and more.
It's 6 p.m. on Thursday, August 28th here in Korea. Live from Seoul, I'm Laah Hyun-kyung.
And I'm Daniel Choy. Thank you for joining us. We begin with a quest for the truth behind the Sewol-ho tragedy. Mr. Kim Young-ho ended his near 7-week-long hunger strike earlier in the day.
He says it's not because there were meaningful progress in negotiations regarding the so-called ferry bill, but because he has to live to fight on. Myung-kil has our top story.
A prominent relative of the victims of the ferry disaster ended his 46-day hunger strike, raising hopes of a breakthrough in a political deadlock that has paralyzed parliamentary proceedings in Korea for months. The fasting by Kim Young-ho, the father of one of 233 students killed in the April ferry sinking, has been the focal points of protests by victims' families demanding an independent investigation into the circumstances behind the disaster.
Although I decided to end the hunger strike, I will continue to protest until the special law is passed at the National Assembly. My goal is to build a country that is safe to live in. When I get better, I will go back to the Gwanghwamun Square.
The families want a committee in charge of the probe to be given investigative powers, but rival parties have been unable to come to terms on an agreement that satisfies all sides. The bereaved families say the end of Kim's hunger strike is not indicative of any progress being made in negotiations, and that their protests will continue. But the end of Kim's fasting is raising hopes that differences will be bridged. The ruling Saenuri Party is most optimistic. Ruling party leaders held a second round of talks with representatives of the victims' families on Wednesday and reported progress. Another meeting is scheduled for next Monday. The talks are taking place with a newfound sense of urgency. The main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy has boycotted all parliamentary activities in protest at the ruling party's refusal to give bereaved family members a greater say in negotiations over a bill that would probe the causes of the ferry accident. The ruling and opposition parties have reached agreement on the legislation on 2 previous occasions, but both drafts were rejected by the Sewol-ho ferry families. Myung-kil, Arirang News.
The South Korean Defense Ministry has dismissed claims suggested in a U.S. report which said North Korea is building a submarine capable of launching ballistic missiles. Seoul's Defense Ministry official says Pyongyang's submarine would need to weigh at least 3,000 tons in order to be able to launch a ballistic missile, but the largest identified on record so far in the North Korean Navy only weighs 1,800 tons. This comes a day after a U.S. report said a new type of missile launch tube was observed on a North Korean submarine, hinting at the possibility that the regime may be close to developing a ballistic missile submarine.
It's only been a day since the leaders of Ukraine and Russia met in Belarus, but Ukraine is accusing Russia of crossing over its southeast border with military forces. The U.S. State Department says a Russia-led counteroffensive may be in the works. Our Yurian reports.
The House of Culture in the eastern Ukraine rebel stronghold of Donetsk consumed in fire. While some fled, some stayed to examine the damage. Locals there say the fire killed one and left a few others wounded. This comes as Ukraine accused Russia of new military incursions on Wednesday, the latest development in 5 months of fighting between Ukrainian government forces and pro-separatist rebels. Russia has constantly denied accusations it is supplying weapons and sending soldiers to help the rebel forces. No reaction yet from Moscow on the alleged incursion. This latest escalation comes only a day after hours of talks between the two countries' presidents seem to mark a turning point in a 5-month-old crisis. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko and Russian President Vladimir Putin, along with EU representatives, met on Tuesday in Minsk.
Yesterday's talks in Minsk were very effective. I clearly stressed that there will be no bargaining over sovereignty, territorial integrity, the independence of our country, the sovereign choice of the Ukrainian people.
Following the talks, Putin also said Moscow will contribute to create a situation of trust, but hopes the war that killed over 2,200 had hit a turning point are quickly fading from Wednesday's attack. Also, less than 24 hours since the Minsk meeting, Ukraine warned Europe that Russia plans to halt gas transit to Europe by the end of the year. Russia denied the claim, saying it is making maximum efforts to fulfill its contracts with Europe. Yurian, Arirang News.
Shinzo Abe continues to do what he does best, upsetting neighboring countries with his flawed perception of history. The government has confirmed that the PM recently sent a note hailing some of the country's worst war criminals as martyrs and the foundation of their country. The news may further strain Tokyo's ties with neighboring countries, including, of course, Korea. Our Kwon So-hwa has this report.
It comes as no great surprise anymore when Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe chooses to glorify some of Japan's worst war criminals, much to the despair and anger of Japan's neighbors who suffered under Japanese imperialism. Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga has confirmed that Abe sent a note to a memorial ceremony in late April. In his message, Abe offers his sincere condolences to the criminals whom he refers to as martyrs that became the foundation of the country's peace and prosperity. It was the first time a sitting prime minister sent such a note, but Suga said Abe's remarks did not come from his capacity as prime minister.
In this case, he sent this message as Shinzo Abe and the head of the Liberal Democratic Party. As such, the government thinks of him in this respect as a private citizen.
Korea's foreign ministry told Arirang News that it's deeply concerned by Prime Minister Abe's act, calling it another denial of the post-war structure set by the international community to address Japan's past atrocities. On the same day, China demanded that the Japanese government make a clean break with militarism for the sake of rebuilding relations with its neighbors. The ceremony's venue was founded in 1994 to worship nearly 1,200 soldiers convicted of some of the worst wartime crimes. 14 Class A war criminals are among those who are also honored at the more well-known Yasukuni War Shrine in Tokyo. Kwon So-hwa, Arirang News.
Well, before becoming known for his nationalistic policies, Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was better known for his so-called Abenomics.
Right, and in recent weeks, if not months, Korea's Chaenomics, named after Korea's finance minister Choi Kyung-hwan, have been making the headlines.
And now the two nomics are being observed side by side. So today we are going to examine the impacts of Abenomics on Japan's economy, as well as how a comparison can be drawn with Choinomics.
To help us do that, we are joined in the studio by Professor Youngjung Suk from the Catholic University of Korea.
Welcome to the program.
Happy to be here.
Right. So, Professor, let's start with where Japan's economy stands as of now. Its second quarter GDP number was released recently, and it came in at minus 6.8%. So, his policies are largely being blamed.
Yeah, well, there were three pillars to Abenomics. The first is you have a very expansionary monetary policy. You can argue that that component worked. Japan had been in deflation, but they're now experiencing inflation, and it seems to have a lot of expansionary effects. The second pillar, which is the problem right now, is that first they decided to have a very expansionary government spending. So that had very good effects up to the first quarter of this year. But because Japan had such a big government debt to begin with, they needed to have an increase in consumption tax. Now, I think what Abe was hoping for was that they front-loaded government increases in government spending, so that would have multiplier effects. And when this tax hit, it wouldn't hit that hard. But that was, I think, miscalculated. Then the third pillar, which is for the long term, have structural and regulatory reform. Well, Japan's parliament hasn't gotten too far ahead on that yet, because the Japanese government, I think, they've shown in the last 30 years that they try to evade any controversy as much as possible, at least domestically. So I think that's being somewhat delayed or weaker than everybody expected. So that's undermining the confidence in the whole Abenomics program.
Right, playing it safe. It sounds like Japan. Well, the policy at first it seemed like it was working fine. Where did it actually go wrong? Could you maybe pinpoint us to some of those details?
As I mentioned, the first problem was that before the recovery really held on, they hit the economy with a large increase in consumption tax. And this is sort of a pattern that Japan has been shown for the last 20 years. They would begin to have a big expansionary policy, and just when it seems to start working, they cut down the program because they were worried about the government debt. So this just shows the danger of having a large government debt before going into recessions like these. And then, as I mentioned before, because the third pillar was being delayed, I think that's undermined the confidence in the whole program. If you want the people to spend now, they got to expect that things will be better in the future, and also they have to have some inflationary expectation. Prices will rise in the future, so you're better off getting it now. But because the reforms are being delayed, I think they're not confident that that type of increases will continue.
Right. So if the timing was right, then it would have worked, but the timing is a little bit off.
Yeah, I think a lot of Western economists were really worried that this increase in consumption tax was coming too soon, and I think they're proven to be right.
And recently, the foreign media has been eyeing Korea's Choynomics, and the two nomics are different but similar at the same time.
Yeah, I tend to think of Choynomics as sort of a mini version of Abenomics. I say mini because, well, the Korean economy hasn't been as badly performing as Japan. Japan's now lost 20 years. Korea, at best, maybe lost about 5 years. So we still have room. We're still worried about the government debt, but we're nowhere near as bad as Japan. So we can afford to start off with a smaller program, I think. And this just shows that you need to carry out those three pillars together and to keep that program going for a while so that people can have their expectations confirmed. And also, you need to follow all three pillars at once, not just the expansionary government fiscal policy and monetary policy, but you also need to couple it with regulatory and structural reforms. Now, the Park administration has been announcing a lot of these reforms. There's some controversy over whether they'll be effective or not, but at least the Park administration has been making them. But a slight problem is that they're all being delayed at the National Assembly because of political infighting. So that's a bit worrisome.
Right, it's worrisome because the later it starts, the later we'll see what little bits of outcome we could see formulating from that movement. There are concerns that the Choynomics could bring about similar outcome to Abenomics in the long run. For example, depreciated local currency. Do you see that coming? A 90% possibility?
Depreciation of the won, I don't really see it as see it right now because Korea is, well, not to Koreans maybe, but to foreigners, we're doing fairly well. So Korean won has been on an appreciation path for the last 2 years with big fluctuations. The problem actually, I think, is the fluctuations rather than the trend itself. And unless we get ourselves in a big problem, for example, our government deficit blows up, or our household debt, the increases has been larger than expected. Unless things like that happen, I expect the appreciation trend to continue.
Right, it's all about timing, and of course we have a case study to refer to in the form of Japan,
yes,
thankfully.
All right, and we will have to keep in mind that the economic structure is also quite different, that of Japan and that of Korea.
Well, as I said, Korea has only been in a problem for about last 5 years or so. Japan has been more than 20.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Youngjung Suk, for coming into the studio and sharing your insights today.
Thank you.
One-day entry ban. 77.
Digging deeper, getting to the bottom of stories that impact your life. talking with you on air and online, connecting you with experts on the world's most pressing issues. News and current affairs at its best. With Laah Hyun-kyung and Daniel Choy.
Arirang News. Arirang News.
On Early Edition at 6.
Well, staying on the topics of economics, Korea logged a current account surplus for the 29th straight month in July. This time, imports grew faster than exports. So does this indicate a rebound in domestic consumption, something that the government has been trying so very hard to achieve? Our economics correspondent Hwang Ji-hye has some answers.
Korea has posted a current account surplus every month for nearly 2.5 years now. The central bank says the nation logged a surplus of $7.91 billion last month. That's almost identical to the $7.92 billion surplus recorded in June and to the $7.9 billion surplus in the same month last year. Exports of products rose 1% from a year earlier to almost $54 billion on strong shipments of automobiles and steel products, while imports increased 3.5% to $47 billion. The Bank of Korea says, however, that the rise in imports does not necessarily indicate a pickup in domestic demand as it comes on the back of strong oil prices. Experts also warn on too much optimism.
The import volume still remains sluggish, but the rise in energy prices pulled up the total amount of imports. So the current account surplus is still largely coming from the slumping domestic demand.
The current account surplus during the January to July period now stands at over $47 billion, up 20% from the same period a year ago. The bank expects the Korean economy to easily reach its $84 billion current account surplus projection for all of this year, but adds that this month's surplus is likely to fall short of July's due to fewer working days. Hwang Ji-hye, Arirang News.
Korea's state-run anti-corruption agency has started cracking down on the illegal trade of agricultural, livestock, and fisheries products ahead of the Chuseok, or Korean Thanksgiving holiday, next month. The Anti-Corruption and Civil Rights Commission says it will be closely looking into reports of illegal distribution and sales until September 12th. Anyone who suspects a business of corrupt practices can inform the commission through its website or by dialing 110 in Korea. Those providing information are eligible for up to $1 million in rewards, and their identities will, of course, be protected.
Moving on to other stories, Korea has apparently been spending way too much money to make up for the lack of economic participation by women. A new report says government funds for working moms are being wasted and more needs to be done to get those women back to work after having kids, that is. Our Shin Se-min tells us more.
Roughly $192 billion. That's the social cost over the past 13 years due to the lagging economic participation rate of women in Korea, according to a new report by the Korean Women's Development Institute. It points out three main sources for the total. They include reduced salaries for women who re-enter the workplace, the expenses to retain these female employees once they return to the workforce, and an increase in government budget to support the economic participation of women. The $192 billion total suggests a number of things, one being that government efforts to address the gender gap in the Korean workplace have not been effective. Many Korean women leave their careers to raise children and have difficulties returning to the workforce later on. When they do, they're often forced to settle for lower-paying part-time jobs. Over $600 million in this year's national budget are allocated towards supporting the economic participation of women and helping them keep their jobs. But the report suggests that the money is not being used effectively, and it calls for changes, pointing out that Korea's aging population and low birth rate are major obstacles for future growth, and that getting women more actively engaged would help minimize the negative effects. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Kia Motors is looking to expand its presence in the North American market by building a huge plant in South America. The company says it will be a great access point, which will help Kia take better advantage of a growing industrial base. Our Kim Ji-yeon has the details.
Korea's second largest automaker, Kia Motors Corporation, plans to build its first factory in Pesqueria, Mexico, just 200 kilometers south of the U.S. state of Texas. The company will invest more than $1 billion in the plant, which covers 500,000 square meters of land. The assembly plant is expected to start producing 300,000 Forte compact cars and Rio subcompacts in a year.
So this additional 300,000 will help us to be one of the leading automotive manufacturers in the global market.
Mexico has been a great attraction for the automotive industry. Local demand for cars is around 1 million units a year, and labor is cheap and highly productive. The country also boasts great access to markets in the U.S. and Canada, as Mexico is a member of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Due to this, auto giants, including General Motors, Volkswagen, Toyota, and Nissan, have already built assembly lines in the country. Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto says Kia's expansion in the region will help boost investment in the country.
Kia's commitment is to induce more investment from auto part companies of $1.5 billion.
Korean automakers have to pay duties of up to 20% when directly exporting to Mexico due to lack of a free trade agreement between the two countries. But now with a plant in Mexico, Kia expects to raise the proportion of its global production from 44% to rival that of other automotive giants, which hover around 75%. Kim Jung, Arirang News.
And now on to my personal favorite story of the day. If you grew up in Korea in the 80s or 90s or even in the 2000s, like you and I, you are bound to have grown up with banana-flavored milk made by a company called 빙그레. It's right there.
Right. I love the fact that they used the term banana-flavored instead of banana milk because they didn't have any banana in it, apparently.
Exactly.
Well, regardless, the beverage is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. Our Connie Lee tells us the secret behind its long-running popularity.
It was in 1974 when banana-flavored milk first appeared in stores around Korea in its unique jug-shaped bottle. It came out at a time when the Korean government was urging its citizens to drink more milk. To encourage people, food and beverage manufacturer 빙그레 had the bright idea to flavor the milk with banana, a fruit once considered a luxury.
Bananas were expensive during that time and not easily available. People appreciated just getting a taste of this fruit through this drink.
The drink was a big hit then, and it's still a big hit now, enjoyed by people of all ages.
I like it because it's sweet. My friends like it too, and drinking it makes us happy.
Over 800,000 bottles are produced each day as the company's factories strive to meet the demand. In Korea alone, about 250 million bottles of banana milk are sold each year. That means in Korea, an average person drinks about 5 a year. Sales also back up the drink's increasing popularity. From 92 billion won, or about $90 million in 2005, sales surpassed $148 million in 2013.
Overall, we believe the drink's unchanging nature makes it a success. The taste and look of the drink hasn't changed much over the past 40 years. And in the next 40 years, we want to be a recognized global brand like Coca-Cola.
The drink is already being recognized in China. Exports were a mere 500 million won in 2009, but they reached 15 billion won, or about $14.8 million last year. Officials credit the popularity of the Korean wave and the increased number of Chinese tourists to Korea for the explosive growth of banana-flavored milk. Connie Lee, Arirang News.
Well, the fall is fast approaching, but the summer doesn't seem to be saying goodbye just yet.
Looks like. Let's turn to our Michelle Park at the Weather Center to find out when it's going to cool down. Michelle?
Good evening, and it was a hot day here in Seoul, and it's now 6:15, and temperatures are still lingering in the high 20s. However, temperatures are expected to drop quite a bit as we move into the evening, and tomorrow morning will stay cool as well, and some regions will even drop into the high teens. So keep that in mind and carry a light sweater or a cardigan with you. And we can expect a cloudy day tomorrow nationwide, however, due to the instability in the atmosphere, as sudden showers are in the forecast in the central region during the day. Now going over to our temperature readings. Seoul will top out the Friday morning at 21 before reaching up to 29 degrees in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Daegu and Busan will see up to 27 and 26 degrees. Now moving over to other regions, Jeju-Hwadan tops over to 24, while Dokdo peaks to 22, while Mangkungang tops out at 24. Well, that's all for now. I'm Michelle Park, and back to you guys.
Thank you for that, Michelle. And we've come to the end of our newscast. Thank you for staying with us. To our viewers in different time zones, do have a wonderful day. This has been Daniel Choy.
And I'm Laah Hyun-kyung, wishing our viewers in Korea a good rest of the evening. And Daniel and I will be back same time tomorrow.